Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I know people are still trickling in, but I'm going to start with the introductions because we have a pretty packed agenda. I wanted to say thank you and welcome. My name is Nonoko Sato. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the president and CEO of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. I wanted to thank you for joining us today for this important town hall conversation on addressing fraud. This is certainly a complicated topic tied to opinions our state officials may have as they consider further regulations that could impact our entire sector. And we also recognize that the nonprofit sector, as a vital part of our civil society, is also in itself under attack. We want to be clear that we do not condone fraud. No one does. Nonprofits are not immune from being used for fraudulent purposes either. Yet it is important to recognize that actions of a few are not representative of our entire sector, which is doing critical work to serve community needs. Just as much as a few bad actors should not be used to blanketly vilify entire identities, countries, or communities, and they should not define nonprofits as a whole. Minnesota is a welcoming state, and we recognize the important contributions that immigrants, refugees, migrants, people of color, Native people, and generations of Minnesotans make to our economy and to the immense pride we hold in our state. The narrative of rampant fraud in the nonprofit sector is false, period. We refuse to be used as scapegoats and partisan talking points. Instead, we must emphasize the critical and valuable impact nonprofits make in the day-to-day lives of Minnesotans. As we often say here at MCN, nonprofits impact lives from birth, from hospitals to clinics, to death, cemeteries, and everything in between. We must find the balance of remaining a transparent and accountable sector while limiting unnecessary burdens on organizations already carrying so much, especially in this moment. So as you navigate questions from donors, government agencies, and elected officials, we want to ensure you are equipped with facts. We also want to ensure and offer a community-driven solutions that address where fraud has actually occurred, solutions created by organizations with demonstrated trust, longstanding impact, and deep roots in their areas of work. So thank you again for taking the time to join with us today. MCN believes in the power of the collective, and we believe together we can begin to shift the narratives. And with that, I turn it over to Hala or Marie.
Thanks, Nanoko. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Marie Ellis, and I'll be joined in a few minutes by my colleague, Hala Henderson. And together, we make up half of MCN's public policy team, expertly led by Hala. We are here to talk about everyone's favorite topic, and yes, that is dripping with sarcasm, fraud, specifically fraudulent use of state dollars, misconceptions about that fraud, how to talk about it, and what should be done about it. So what we're going to do is first look at some misconceptions about fraud in Minnesota, what we've learned through extensive research, and then we'll look at ways to talk about fraud when it comes up in everyday conversations, and then our recommendations for lawmakers and how you can help to move the narrative in a more positive direction. But first, we want to get a baseline understanding of how prevalent fraud themes are in your world. And so a poll should be popping up on your screen. And the question is, are you hearing or how much are you hearing narratives about fraud and nonprofits? This could be from donors and volunteers. It could be in the news or with colleagues. So the scale is 0 to 1. 0 is like not at all. I don't even know why you're having this town hall or why I'm here. And 10 is, if I hear one more thing about this topic, I'm out of here. I'm moving to the for-profit sector. I'll give folks just a minute to do that. And then when we're done with that one, we've got a second poll for you. And that one is about how comfortable you feel responding to narratives around fraud and nonprofits. And so that scale 0 is like, if I hear anything of the sort, I'm going to crawl under the table and play possum. And 10 is like, get me a podium because we are about to have a serious debate and I will win the debate. That's very comfortable. I don't think I'm even there, and I spend my days on this stuff. All right. We'll have a couple more poll questions for you at the end, but let's get into it. What exactly do we mean by fraud? We are using the state's definition. Pele, if you could move to the next slide, that'd be great. And the state's definition in statute is an intentional or deliberate act to deprive another of property or money or to acquire property or money by deception. And the key there is that we're using the words intentional or deliberate. So this is not about mistakes made in good faith. Fraud has become a partisan issue, as most of you know, if not all of you, rather than just a policy issue. And it's being used to justify increased scrutiny on nonprofits and others, funding restrictions, and even immigration enforcement. Some of the attempts to curtail fraud have led to really broad punitive responses, overcorrections, and even cutting Minnesotans off from critical services. Here's the thing, both sides have it wrong. So we're going to help you understand what's actually going on and how we can all work together to set the record straight. So let's start with something that we hear a lot. We hear, maybe not exactly in these words, but the sentiment is there, that most fraud cases involve nonprofits. Unfortunately, I think that's what a lot of the public and our elected officials think. But the truth is, the majority of fraud in recent cases of high profile fraud has been conducted by bad actors using for-profits. Let me just take a look. Yes, Pele, can you move to the next slide as well? There we go. Thank you. So why on earth are nonprofits taking the bad rap for this? I think there's a few reasons. First, that big initial case of fraud with state dollars is known as the Feeding Our Future scandal. And Feeding Our Future was a nonprofit. Although, side note, Feeding Our Future was actually not compliant with a lot of the laws that my colleague Josh will be talking about in a little while. They had their tax exempt status revoked by the IRS within a few years of operating. And so they were not a nonprofit in the sense that all of your organizations are nonprofits and following the laws. You might recall Feeding Our Future was an intermediary, and so they sponsored sites that were supposedly, and in some cases actually, providing food to children during the pandemic. At least half of those sites were run by for-profit businesses. But that fact is not in the news at all. Another side note, it's also no longer an option. For-profit organizations were only allowed to be sites for the child nutrition programs during COVID. There was like a waiver situation for that. So that is not allowed anymore. Additionally, why I think we're getting the bad rap is that a lot of news reports about fraud use really general terms. They talk about fraud in Minnesota's human services or Minnesota's safety net programs. And I know when I hear those terms, I think of nonprofits providing those services. And then the last thing I think is a lot of the organizations, the businesses that have been found to have committed fraud sound like nonprofits, right? Star Autism Center sounds like a nonprofit. Some of them have words like community services in their names. And so it's pretty reasonable to think they might be a nonprofit, but they're not. Let's try another misconception. This is something I think a lot of folks think that it's easy to commit fraud through a nonprofit. But as hopefully most of you know, nonprofits are generally held to a higher public standard than for-profits. Next slide, Pele. So I'll start with an important distinction here, which is that organizations don't commit fraud. Individuals commit fraud through organizations. Fraud can be committed through nonprofits and for-profits. But as we'll be hearing from Josh in a little while, there are a lot of laws and rules that nonprofits need to follow, and our finances are pretty darn transparent. It is much more difficult to commit fraud with state dollars through a nonprofit. And let's talk for a minute about a few of those requirements and then sort of whether they're in place for-profit businesses as well. So a few of the requirements that nonprofits are subject to include filing a 990 every year. That's our tax form essentially, which includes revenue sources, expenses, executive compensation, lobbying expenses, governance policies, and a whole bunch of other things. Whereas for-profit businesses, tax returns are not public unless they're a publicly traded company or something like that. Nonprofit, oh, actually, that's not true. That's for something else. Take away that last part I said. For-profit tax returns are not public. Nonprofits need to conduct independent financial audits if annual revenue exceeds $750,000, and they submit those to the Minnesota Attorney General. This is where I meant to say businesses only need to do independent financial audits if they're a publicly traded company, or if another entity requires it, like if they're asking for a loan from a bank, the bank may require that they do an independent financial audit, but certainly not required every year, like for most nonprofits. And nonprofits need to maintain a board of directors with at least 3 members, and they all hold fiduciary responsibilities, which are legal and important responsibilities. Okay, the last misconception we'll look at for now is that major fraud has been found in a lot of state programs. That's definitely what the media makes it seem like. But the fact is, major fraud has actually been confirmed in only 3 programs. It was all through claims-based payments, not state grants. A little more on that later. I will note there was a news story that broke last week that the state is suing a nonprofit over money received through a state grant, stating that the money wasn't used for an eligible purpose. We don't have all the facts on that situation at this point. There's no conviction or decision. So we're setting that aside for now in terms of what we know, but we'll, of course, be following that closely. So the 3 major cases of fraud using state dollars in recent years has been through Child Nutrition Program, and that's Feeding Our Future, EIDBI, which I can never remember the acronym of, but that's Autism Services. That's a state program, particularly 2 for-profit businesses there that have been charged. And then the last one is Housing Stabilization Services, and 5 for-profit businesses have been charged there. So outside of Feeding Our Future, there have been no nonprofits charged with fraud that we have been able to find. Next, I'll pass the mic over to Hala to talk about the 2 main ways that the state funds services through nonprofits and for-profits, and how we can all start to help shift the negative narratives that are out there. Over to you, Hala.
Thanks, Marie. And this is such an interesting conversation, right? Because I think the way that people assume nonprofits are funded are often different than the ways that nonprofits are funded. So the first way nonprofits experience state funding is really through state grants, which can be awarded competitively through an RFP or directly. And if the organization is actually named in law. Each state agency also has its own version of how they do things, but they're all really guided by policies set by the Office of Grants Management. The second way is through what we've termed as claims-based payments, and that's a system where an organization is authorized by the state to provide services. They provide services and then bill the state. And when you think of these services, you're probably thinking of things like Medicaid eligible services that use that payment model. But it's also the model that was used in the 3 major cases of fraud that Marie just named. And for example, with Feeding Our Future, the sponsored sites were reimbursed based on how many children that they said that they fed. So there are 2 reasons this distinction is really important. First, it's that policymakers have tried to end fraud and address fraud by adding oversight to specifically state grants, which is not where, to our knowledge, the vast majority of fraud has occurred. It's largely, in our opinion, and what our research has shown us, a waste of time and can result in duplicative compliance requirements, which means more work, both for the nonprofit grantee, but also for the state. The second reason is an important distinction. It's an important distinction because the media often refers to fraud in Minnesota as widespread. And we have some qualms with that. There's been a large amount of money. It has been a large amount of money for the average Minnesotan, but it's been really pretty contained to a few programs. And when you think of the larger picture, and I think we're on the next slide in just a moment, Pele, when you think of the larger picture, it's relatively small to how much funding in total is invested in basic services. I'll also note we are not cataloging every accusation of fraudulent use of state dollars, and there are quite a few cases in Medicaid eligible services that have seen much smaller instances of fraud. We think it's really important for the state to review those cases, but we're really focusing on major cases of fraud because that's where the state should really be focusing its efforts first. Okay, so you might be wondering, what is this giant circle and all of these little circles surrounding it? And we've been digging into state data for a while now to really understand the ecosystem of state funding. How do we fund basic needs services in for Minnesotans? And so we've used some high-level estimates to create a visual that we think helps to tell the story. There are really three major sources of funding from the state for these services. There's claims-based, which represents the vast majority of funding, and you can see that in the largest bubble or circle. There's competitive state grants, which is a smaller green circle. And then there are legislatively named grants, which is the smallest circle. To add another layer of nuance to this visual, we've also added circles to depict the relative amounts of confirmed and unconfirmed fraud in these funding streams in recent years. So the small pink circle within the red, if you can see that, represents the amount of fraud that has happened in claims-based payments in recent years. Within the blue and green circles are funding for services through the two types of grant contracts, and you can see that there are much smaller amounts, both in claims-based, and you might notice there's a tiny dot, a tiny little circle within competitive grants, and no circles whatsoever in legislatively named grants. So we think that context is really important in understanding the water that we're swimming in and the funding that exists. And it doesn't discount the places where fraud has occurred, but it does provide, we think, some really important context. We are going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we frame some of this conversation and how we talk about all of this outside of our nonprofit bubbles. So we can move on to the next slide. Great. Okay, let's take an example of something you might hear out in the wilds or at a conversation with some family. There's just not enough oversight of what nonprofits are doing with state dollars. The state really needs to crack down. So how do you even begin to push back on that, right? Where do you start? If you're like some of us, you might freeze because you don't want to get into a conversation with some family, but we have some ideas on how we can move through that to add some nuance to the rhetoric and hopefully make some inroads. Next slide. Okay. So we've put together a few phrases that we think could be helpful. It's nothing earth-shattering, and to be honest, I'm sure most of the folks here know a lot of this, but we think that it helps to counter misinformation, and while it might not make anyone do a full 180, it helps to push back. So a few things to lift up. Number one, you could say something like, I know from my job at a nonprofit that nonprofits' tax returns are public, and nonprofits, except the really small ones, need to have an independent financial audit every year. Generally, people aren't going to ask a ton of additional questions about what that means and what your financial audit looks like. You could also say something along the lines of, what's interesting is that in the major cases that people are often talking about, most of the fraud didn't happen through nonprofit grant programs. It was primarily through for-profit entities. That's a conversation starter. You could also add, from what I've seen, adding more requirements across the board can create a lot of administrative burden without necessarily preventing the kind of fraud that we're talking about. And one of my favorites, a more effective approach to targeting fraud is really focusing on the specific programs or warning signs where issues have actually occurred. And spoiler alert, you can follow that up by leaning into the experts and the folks who already do this work. We do have one more that I'll lift up here because it'll relate to some of the pieces Marie's going to talk through in a little bit. But if folks start asking more questions about grants and reporting and compliance requirements, you could say, I actually work pretty closely with this. And there's already a lot of oversight built into state grants, reporting, audits, and compliance requirements. Here's the thing, though. You don't actually need to win the argument. The goal is simply to expand the conversation, to add nuance, and to listen. And with that, I'm going to turn it right back over to Marie.
Thank you, Hala. We're going to talk now about some recommendations that we put together for policymakers, and these are all very much informed by what we've been hearing from nonprofits across the state. So thank you to everyone who's been helping to put these together. This is the good stuff, if you ask me. So a link to our page on protecting public dollars and preserving critical services is in the chat. And on that page, you can download a printable document that has all of this information, if that's helpful for you. This page shares some of the important facts on page 1, or the document does. And then there are 5 recommendations for policymakers. And in this case, we're talking mostly about state legislators and the governor. And that's on pages 2 and 3. They're really pretty common sense recommendations, but they're not being followed. So it makes sense to highlight some of these. We have shared all of this with all 201 legislators and the governor's office, but these are the kind of things that someone needs to see many times for it to sink in or for them to understand why it's important. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we are asking you to please share this document or this webpage with your legislators. You can highlight one or two of these recommendations that really resonates for your organization. So our first recommendation to policymakers is, you're ready for a crazy idea, focus oversight reforms where the fraud has occurred. I was again being sarcastic when I said that was a wild idea. This seems pretty obvious, hopefully, but as we noted before, there has been a good deal of legislation focused on state grants and essentially making it harder and less equitable for state grants to be provided. And that's not where major fraud has occurred, not where small fraud has occurred either. There's a lot of talk at the state about fraud, waste, and abuse, and it's wasteful to expend a lot of energy trying to fix a problem that doesn't really exist. Our second recommendation is to avoid disruptions to essential services. You've likely seen in the news that there have been some really broad funding cuts and payment freezes imposed by the state in response to fraud. And in some cases, these have disrupted essential and life-saving services. We think that the legislature should require state agencies to have a continuity of services plan before they broadly pause or cut funding to any basic needs provider to ensure that everybody has access to those services that they need. The third recommendation is that the state apply transparency standards across all providers. The more I think about this one, the more I love it. So hopefully you will too. So as we've talked about a bit, both nonprofit and for-profit entities can provide basic needs services in Minnesota. But as we said before, 501c3 charitable nonprofits need to publicly disclose our revenue sources, expenses, lobbying expenses, governance policies, all that jazz. If we have revenue over $750,000 annually, we need to conduct an independent financial audit. We need a board of directors. We register with the Attorney General's office. And we think for-profit service providers who are reimbursed by the state for their services using public dollars should be subject to comparable transparency requirements. I'll turn it over to Hala to talk about 4 and 5.
Awesome. Thanks, Marie. So our fourth recommendation is really that the state should be engaging providers operating with integrity. We think that the best folks to look to are the people who are doing the work. We've been able to talk with nonprofit staff who work in finance about fraud, and they, or maybe even some folks in the audience, all know so much. Nonprofit staff, particularly folks in finance, especially ones who work with multiple state programs, have so much practical insight that no one at the state often has or has time to dig into. We've heard from folks that where one state program does a really great job with a particular piece of oversight, another program might be missing that piece of oversight completely. And we think that nonprofit experts, you all, can say what level of administrative compliance is reasonable and what level is too much. So we want the state to talk with you, to identify problems, and to develop practical solutions that reduce fraud risk while maintaining effective service delivery. Next slide. Finally, our fifth recommendation is that the state invest in state infrastructure. The state's technology used to administer claims-based payments is very outdated in many cases and limits the state's ability to monitor programs and identify problems early. One of the least popular things to suggest at the legislature is that the state fund more state staff, FTEs, but modern technology and staffing are requirements to supporting our work and are critical tools for the state. So if you found yourself thinking, yeah, that's important, to any of these, we ask, one, that you share that insight with your legislators, but also share it amongst yourselves. Share it with the networks of nonprofits that you exist in, but also your legislators. Because at the legislature, right, we believe, and we said this at the beginning, that there is a clear misunderstanding, a bipartisan misunderstanding of how nonprofits work and the investments that are needed to continue the work that we do. Okay. So I think I'm turning it right back over to you again, Marie.
Indeed, I'm here. Thank you. All right, so we've talked about adding nuance to everyday conversations about fraud, and that a really impactful thing you can do is talk to your legislators. So let's talk more about that. Um, like the slide said, let's look at how you can help. Your legislators, and right now I'm focusing on your state senators and state representatives. Those are the folks that work at the Capitol in St. Paul, not the Capitol in DC. They should know about the work that your organization does, like totally unrelated to this conversation about fraud or anything else. If you're a nonprofit doing good work in the state, the people who represent your area should know that it's happening. So you can, and so setting up time to talk with them, you can also then use that opportunity to show them your 990, make sure they understand that this information about nonprofits is out there and really easy to find. You can highlight some of the important information there. If you have a government grant, you can show them your last report or your application, because truly there are many legislators who think that a state grant is the state handing over some money and saying, have fun, do good work. And those of you that have worked with government grants know that that is not true. You can also share the recommendations document that we have in these 5 recommendations. Pick 1 or 2 that really resonate for your organization or for you and highlight those with your legislators. If you have public policy staff at your organization, talk to them about how to go about connecting with your legislators. If you don't have public policy staff, I just want to make sure everyone knows that legislators are just regular people and they get invited to talk with organizations all the time. Like, it is very normal and very common to call or email their office and say, we're a nonprofit based in your district and we'd like to share some of the important work that we do. You can invite them to meet at your nonprofit if that makes sense, over coffee, at their office if you're in the metro, or virtually. And you might be thinking, but we're not allowed to lobby. Yes, you are. Actually, 501c3 nonprofits totally can lobby, but this actually isn't even lobbying. You're talking with your legislator and explaining what your nonprofit does, sharing the financial transparency that your nonprofit is subject to. That's education, and you don't really need to worry about reporting that at all. We do also have some tools on our website to support you in connecting with legislators. So that link should be in the chat shortly if it's not already. My original notes for this had about 20 more minutes on the importance of connecting with legislators, but I had to cut that out. So just know that, like, please, if we put all these great recommendations together, but they don't get to the people who get to make the decisions, they're pretty useless. So help us make them useful by sharing them. A third way that you specifically can be helpful in all of this is by knowing the story behind the numbers in your nonprofit's financials. Sometimes it looks like an organization has a ton of cash on hand on their 990, but actually it's in-kind donations. Or maybe there's a 3-year grant that came in a lump sum and it's very much restricted funding, but it doesn't look like that when you look at the balance sheet. So ask your executive director or your finance person to walk you through it. You could also ask to sit in on a board finance committee meeting to understand, how the financials are being communicated to the board. You can find your 990 online. Hopefully it's on your nonprofit's webpage, but if not, you can find it on sites like GuideStar and ProPublica, and see what questions that brings up. Look through it and see what you don't understand. And additionally, if you're in a leadership position, support other staff, the staff you work with, to understand more about your organization's financials. So if I haven't made this clear, let me say it again. We really need you. You are the folks who understand how a lot of these things work in practice, particularly if you're finance staff. You see, all the different systems, the checks, the reporting, the audits. We really need that to be part of the conversation. But we really need particularly legislators and other folks in the public to understand what nonprofits do, so that when the word nonprofit comes up, they're not immediately thinking of feeding our future, right? We want them to think of your organization when they hear the term nonprofit. So when these conversations come up, right, at work, with your board, with your cousin, at a holiday meal, you don't have to have all the answers. We're not expecting that, but we do hope that folks can add some nuance to those conversations, share what you see in your work, and then just help shift that conversation towards solutions that are actually grounded in reality. I have some resources and opportunities that I want to highlight, and then I'll turn it over to Josh in a couple of minutes. The first one, this is for anyone who's ever applied for or considered applying for a state grant. The state's Office of Grants Management has policies that impact all of the state agencies. They are revising 3 of them in coming months, including the one that talks about the state having a preference for reimbursement, which means that, of course, grantees don't get any upfront funding, any working capital. It's all just reimbursement. And so nonprofits have to float quite a bit of money sometimes before they get reimbursed. And so they're considering revising that policy. So if you have any experience with state grants or if you have thoughts on that, please do not miss this opportunity. The survey closes May 8th. And to our knowledge, this is the first time they've actually ever asked for any external input on their policies. And we are very happy about that because we've been bugging them to do it for a few years now. Next is a toolkit for addressing fraud. There we go. Thank you. This is put together by our fabulous comm staff, and I think it's really helpful. So on one page, you can find the policy recommendations that we've been talking about. You can also find messaging guidance and a resource on combating misconceptions. And then my favorite, because I'm a huge nerd, are the compliance checklists and clinics. Okay, and then lastly is the Minnesota Nonprofit Legal Initiative. Hopefully you've already heard about this incredible resource. Next slide, Pele, thank you. But if not, here's some info, and Josh will say more. Quick overview. The Legal Help Desk is free, and it is available to all Minnesota nonprofits and all MCN members. You may fit both those categories, even better, bonus, but you only have to fit into one for it to be free for you. And nonprofits with annual operating cash budgets under 1.5 million are also able to access one-to-one legal counseling, which might mean you get to talk with Josh, who is our next speaker. We will take Q&A for both Hala and I and Josh after we hear from him. So we'll wait to the very end for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Josh.
Thanks so much, Marie, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Joshua Franklin, and I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Legal Services Director at Legal Corps. As you briefly heard, Legal Corps, in partnership with with Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, is offering the Minnesota Legal Services Initiative specifically to nonprofits that are dealing with these issues, not only of fraud and oversight, but of just generally maintaining your organization on a day-to-day scenario. And so to that standard, we have directed and created a 3-pronged program that can assist your organization directly. And so as Marie briefly stated, and I'll go into a bit more detail, we have the Nonprofit Legal Help Desk, which is a one-on-one opportunity for you to speak directly with Legal Corps and our team of nonprofit specialists directly about your nonprofit and any legal issue you may be facing. As a resource for that program, we also offer the Legal Resource Library, which directly is a documentation library of all different types of organizational support documents and things that you can use for your nonprofit. And lastly, we also have compliance support, which is a compliance assessment for your nonprofit, and additionally also includes one-on-one support with an attorney, often myself, who can assist you all directly with ensuring that your organization has everything that it needs to ensure that it is operating in compliance with the regulatory regime. And so in that regard, I'm going to be continuing this presentation by discussing a little bit more about fraud, what it is and what it is not, as well as some things that you should think about when considering fraud as a general matter. And so I've already gone through these 3 services in the Legal Services Initiative, and so we can just continue and get started. And so as MCN has already alluded to, and as you all may know as nonprofit operators, owners, and other supporters of the sector, nonprofits have quite the oversight associated with them. And primarily, I've identified a couple of initial agencies here that work directly with nonprofits and oversee their compliance regimes. And to go into greater detail, you first have the Minnesota Secretary of State. As you all may know, this Minnesota Secretary of State oversees the business filings for both nonprofit corporations and for-profit corporations. However, interestingly enough, the Minnesota Secretary of State requires more information when certifying your nonprofit with the Secretary of State than an LLC or a C corporation would require. Additionally, there is also a specific requirement that Minnesota nonprofits register with the Minnesota Office of the Attorney General. And primarily, while for-profit corporations are not required to disclose any particular information to the Minnesota Office of the Attorney General, nonprofits are required to each year. And that is whether or not their organization makes more or less than $25,000 in charitable contributions. In addition to oversight by the Minnesota Secretary of State and the Office of the Attorney General generally, there's also additional state oversight and federal oversight of revenue streams. That's by the Department of Revenue here in Minnesota, as well as the IRS, also the Internal Revenue Service. And so in that regard, nonprofits at the federal level are always required to seek tax exemption status through an application, which goes into a large detail, not only about the purpose of your organization, the mission and the value of the organization, but also the specific financial status of your organization. There are particular requirements that are heightened when your organization makes over $50,000. There's additional requirements when your organization makes over $500,000. Each of these add an additional layer of oversight directly to all nonprofits, not only within the state of Minnesota, but throughout the entire country. And lastly, you may also find yourself being overseen by the Department of Justice to the extent that your organization is undergoing any particular challenge with federal or state law. You can find yourself at the behest of the federal Department of Justice, the state Minnesota Office of the Attorney General, or even your county attorney's office. And those are some of the ground framework for the nonprofit regime as a general matter. When we become more specific into the specific mission or vision of your particular organization, you can find that additional agencies also oversee your nonprofit, whether that be the Minnesota Grants Administration if you're obtaining any particular state funds, or the U.S. Health and Human Services, or even GSA, the General Services Administration, if you're receiving any federal funds. And lastly, to the extent that your organization has any particular employees, you may also have oversight directly by the Minnesota Department of Labor or even the U.S. Department of Labor. And so I go into great detail about each one of these particular agencies that oversee nonprofit to really provide a comprehensive ideation and detail of the ways that nonprofits actually have, in large parts, more oversight than for-profit entities. And as a general note, there's all different types of nonprofits. We're often thinking about only nonprofits under 501c3, which would be religious, charitable, scientific, literary, or educational organizations, But you also have a number of other types of nonprofits. You have civic leagues, labor organizations, business leagues, and other professional organizations, fraternal or sorority beneficiary organizations, or even other certain beneficiary organizations and associations, which can also increase the amount of oversight your particular nonprofit may have, depending on the specific type of work that it's providing in the community. And I can't stress enough the amount of critical work and community needs that nonprofits in the Minnesota area and really nationwide provide for local communities, regional communities, and even the national communities here throughout the United States of America within the great state of Minnesota. And so, with respect to understanding the nuances of fraud or any particular fraud narrative, it really is important to go into a little bit of a greater detail to understand and uncover what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about fraud, or whether or not we're using fraud as a more generalized and term to criticize nonprofits. And so, going into a bit greater detail about some common nonprofit requirements beyond specific registrations with the Secretary of State and other related agencies, nonprofits are all also required, as you've heard about, to undergo particular public disclosures. As you all may know, all of their tax forms are public and readily available on organizations such as GuideStar or otherwise. And in addition to their requirement to register with the Minnesota Office of the Attorney General, each nonprofit director and officer also undergo specific fiduciary duties for their organization. And those duties really create a clear standard of care under which organizations must conduct business as a general matter. And while these may be parallel for some for-profit organizations, they're much closely scrutinized with respect to nonprofit organizations. And nonprofit organizations can find themselves in a lot of trouble for skirting some of these fiduciary requirements. And so those fiduciary requirements include the duty of care. That is the duty to act with the organization in its best interest and to further the actions of that organization. Additionally, the duty of loyalty. When acting as a nonprofit director or a nonprofit officer, you are required to have an utmost duty to that organization and make choices and decisions for that organization that are in the organization's best interest, not in any of your individual capacities' best interest. And lastly, that duty of obedience, which I really want to highlight as we talk about fraud. Each nonprofit organization has a duty of obedience not only to federal and state law with respect to the nonprofit statutes, but also with respect to this duty of obedience to the bylaws. And so, in any regard, organizations can also find themselves in a civil fight or even a formal disagreement between partners or other board members as to the duty of obedience as listed here. And so I really want to highlight this as an important note that in addition to the idea that nonprofits are under represented or under scrutinized, they initially have their own deep rooted requirement to obey the law, to oversee the law, and to be loyal to the organization. And so in some of those compliance requirements, which I've identified here and already discussed, I want to really highlight and note that many of these compliance requirements are not directly required to even be considered for nonprofit organizations. So when we talk about nonprofit directors and officers wearing different hats, we really do also talk about them wearing the compliance hat directly because of all of the different compliance regimes that organizations have to go through. And even more so, there are a number of additional considerations that may further increase the scrutiny or duty to comply with different laws under the nonprofit regime. So for organizations that make over $50,000, there's an additional requirement under both federal and state law that your organization needs to undergo. And so if you're dealing with particular questions about the types of regulatory oversight that nonprofit has, this is one of them. for any organization that's receiving over $50,000, there's an additional requirement that they file additional documentation, not only with the Minnesota Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office, but also directly through the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, through the 990. And additionally, there may be considerations based on the age of the organization. There are certainly additional disclosures for organizations that have political expenditures, and certainly not providing information to the legislature does not quite fall under what would be considered a political expenditure or indicate that your organization may be lobbying. And finally, there's additional requirements for oversight for key employees and highly compensated employees. So to the extent that your organization is paying employees and providing direct executive high compensation, there's additional requirements for that organization. Some of these requirements don't exist in for-profit organizations. And some of them only are directly mirrored for publicly traded organizations. And so as we transition a little bit here, I found it important to include a statutory requirement here directly from Minnesota state law that requires that all directors shall discharge the duties of their position as a director of a nonprofit organization in good faith, in a manner that the director believes to be in the best interest of the corporation, with the care an ordinary prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. So when considering the narrative of fraud here in the state of Minnesota and generally throughout the country, we also have to consider that there is a clear standard of what is a nonprofit that's acting in bad faith, or a nonprofit that's acting that's not in the best interest of the corporation, or a nonprofit that may be acting outside of the care of an ordinary prudent person, a person like you and I, that would exercise the same type of control in a like position under similar circumstances. So this here is kind of our objective determination for what would a reasonable person do if they were considered a nonprofit executive. And those types of questions really drill down whether or not fraud is being used as a generic term to further scrutinize the critical work and community work that nonprofits are doing, or whether or not there's clearly a standard for someone to be held liable for acting outside of that duty of care. And so lastly, I did just want to highlight primarily some clearly fraudulent activity versus some other conduct or some activity that, based off news reports, media, and otherwise, has been speculated to be fraudulent. And so clearly fraudulent activity may include lying, making any false representation, violating any financial or operational control, using funds for a prohibited purpose, overbilling or double billing. These types of fraudulent actions are in fact fraudulent. They are illegal. They can result in criminal liability as well as civil liability. But as a general matter, fraud, as it's listed in any statute, is a legal conclusion. And so there are certain activities that don't measure up to the definition of fraud in and of itself, but can be used just to shed a negative light on nonprofits. That can be a nonprofit that is operating with multiple family members on the board. There's nothing clearly fraudulent about that activity. In fact, there are ways to mitigate that fraud through policies such as conflict of interest policies and such. Additionally, activity that we've been hearing in the media that we've been speculating to be fraudulent, serving a community that provides services to undocumented persons, designing programs that prioritize underrepresented communities. Those can be communities based on race, indigenous status, or other persons of color, gender identity, etc. These activities have been scrutinized by particularly this administration and some others and the media as being directly fraudulent activity because they are for a purpose that is being considered uh, not necessarily in line with policy objectives. However, such that your organization is doing things that aren't aligned with policy objectives does not make that activity fraudulent. In fact, going back to the standard of care, in some instances, if you're operating your organization in good faith, then you can find a lot of those particular problems either will go away or limit your specific risk to being found to have engaged in such fraudulent activity because a reasonable person in your same scenario would do the same thing. And certainly here in Minnesota, we identify and further the critical work of working with underrepresented communities, with working with undocumented persons, and otherwise providing critical needs that make our communities safer. And so, with that, I just want to close here by identifying that there are problems within the community, the business community as a whole, and there's always more oversight that can be conducted generally to any particular organization. However, choosing a legal conclusion such as fraud to make an argument that nonprofit sectors should not be funded is certainly not the realm to go and is certainly out of scope of what fraud truly is. And so with that, I'll pass it back over to our friends at MCN for our Q&A session. And again, highlight that if anyone would like to receive more information about the free legal resources and services for Minnesota nonprofits, you can scan the QR code here or visit all of our links in the chat. Thanks all.
Thanks, Joshua. So we have received a number of questions both during this town hall, but then also prior. So we're going to go through some of them. I have, just for context, I've condensed a few that were either on the same page or had very similar themes. So we'll talk through some of them. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to get a hold of us. We would love to connect with you. And there should be contact information, I think, in the very first slide deck for at least Marie and myself. And we'll just also name that there might be some pieces that we don't have all the information for, but we are committed to continuing to explore what those answers might be. So kicking us off, so this is directly related to the report. For the nonprofits that were involved within charged cases of fraud, does the report mean that many were incorporated as a nonprofit within Minnesota but did not have a 501c3 status?
That's a very good question. Also, I love that whoever wrote it knows the difference between being incorporated as a nonprofit and having 501c3 status. So good on you, whoever that was. That took me a while. No, it does not mean that. It means that this is the part of the report I think that talks about it's the third point on the report that many of the nonprofits were not in compliance with a lot of the legal things that Joshua just talked about. So Feeding Our Future was a really interesting case. Specifically, Feeding Our Future's C3 status was revoked. So in that case, they were incorporated as a Minnesota nonprofit, but did not have C3 status. But then their C3 status was reinstated at some point and then revoked again. And we actually, our colleague Kari has been doing some great research and calling some like national experts on the IRS master file and the revocation list, which is just a party. And we still can't quite figure out what happened or when or whether the state should have known that their C3 status was revoked. If we can't figure it out, I don't know that we can expect the state to. And additionally, with Feeding Our Future, they had board members listed who had no idea that they were board members. So there are things like that that have happened in a lot of these different, a lot of the nonprofits that were involved in Feeding Our Future that show that they were not compliant.
Thank you. And on that same thread of Feeding Our Future, can you clarify, did you say that half of those charged within Feeding Our Future were for-profits?
Did say that. Yes, that's a great thing to clarify. So we put together, there isn't a list that we could find anywhere. I mean, hopefully they have it at like the Attorney General's office, but we couldn't find a public list of all of the entities that have been charged as sites in Feeding Our Future. There's also some confusion because some of the sites did legitimately provide meals to children. And so it's a little hard, even if you have a list of all of the sponsored organizations. And then also, it wasn't just Feeding Our Future that was the intermediary involved. There was also Partners in Nutrition. So it all kind of gets lumped together, and there's all these kind of odd spin-off things. But we put together a list as best we could of all the entities that have been charged. And about half of them were for profits and about half were nonprofits. And that is the only place in all these cases of major fraud that there were any nonprofits involved at all.
I think that's a wonderful segue into the next question, which is how do nonprofits emphasize the large number of us who are not fraudulent?
Where are our comms folks? That's who we need right now. I think so. We put up that the toolkit that has some great messaging guidance on there. And I know at the bottom of one of those pages, there's also a link to the National Council of Nonprofits that has got some messaging guidance. It's interesting because we, of course, have been dealing with this in Minnesota for more than 4 years since Feeding Our Future. But it's just really starting to be on the radar of other states because it's become part of the national conversation. So we're seeing some more national resources as well. I mean, from my opinion, and I am not a comms person, I think it really is about sharing the story of your organization. Share it with the media if you can. They like to do stories on good things that are happening too. Share it with your legislators. Um, just try to get the word out there about all the great work. Hala, do you have any thoughts on that? Anything to add?
I would agree with everything you named. I think the biggest piece, particularly when we're talking about it, not just to lawmakers, but to neighbors, right, is
Mhm.
what are the facts that we can rely on and to lean into, and what are the shared experiences? It's been really, really helpful for me as this conversation has come up at dinner tables, right, to talk about the impact of nonprofits in our communities and that it is more than just the things that people assume a nonprofit does. Nonprofits are around us every day. We experience them, enjoy them, contribute to them. And to being able to ground it in that reality is really useful. And to, rely on the resources, right, that we have here, rely on the report. The report's been really helpful both for general public, but also for lawmakers to understand and get a better understanding of our perspectives.
Let me add one more thing that this is a bit of a tangent, but made me think of it, and we have a bit
Okay.
of time. 2 or 3 years ago, the Lilly School of Philanthropy put out a big report, and in it was this little tiny nugget. They had asked people in a poll, have you, I think it was something like, have you been served by a nonprofit in the last, have you or someone in your family been served by a nonprofit in the last 12 months? 5% of people said yes. But I think we all know way more than 5% of people. I think part of the problem there is people think of nonprofits as, soup kitchens and homeless shelters and don't realize that it's also the Humane Society or um, all the many other wonderful things that nonprofits do. So just get the word out that you are a nonprofit.
Nonprofits are all of those wonderful resources and also our community gardens, right?
Right? Exactly.
So flipping gears a little bit and going back into some of the fraud. And I just want to name that some of this, we might not have all of the right answers for you today, but we are absolutely committed to conversation. Is just what happened, right? How did we get here? What do we see as some of the systems that might have enabled the fraud?
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly don't have any insider knowledge of, exactly what was happening at state agencies, so won't even attempt to speak to that. But I do know a couple of the other things that we researched when we were doing all of this that didn't end up in the report, but I think are relevant, is that in all those three major cases of fraud, Feeding Our Future, the autism centers, and housing stabilization services, the people and the entities that have been charged were fairly new. And they also started billing in astronomical numbers very quickly. It kind of made sense in Feeding Our Future because it was during the pandemic. So it was like, okay, this food program that, it made sense that it grew a lot. But for example, in the autism services, I think the state had estimated that the cost of that program, EIDBI, would be about $1.7 million annually. By 2 years into it, it was in the 40 millions. I think that's right. Dozens of millions, anyhow. And 4 years later, it was like $400 million. I mean, just really absurd. And so there are things like that, like that should have been caught. And that's why one of our recommendations is about infrastructure at the state. I mean, that should have been flagged. And the same thing happened with housing stabilization services, is we had these fairly new for-profits come on the scene, start providing services, and just bill astronomically. And that's something, Hala talked about the difference between state grants and claims-based services. And that's one of the differences is a grant has a capped amount, right? It's like your grant is for this much, do the work, then we will reimburse you up to that amount. That's that. But in claims-based reimbursements, the organization, the entity, for-profit or nonprofit, is authorized by the state to provide services. And generally speaking, there are some caveats to this, but generally speaking, as long as the person that they're working with, that they're serving, is eligible for the service they're providing, they provide the service and bill the state. And so there isn't really a cap in that same sense. I might have gotten off subject. Feel free to pull me back in.
No, we have time for tangents, so that works.
Love it.
We have a couple of different questions around this, so I'm going to condense them into how do we break down, right, these more extreme charged cases of fraud versus things that might be construed as fraud on a regular basis. And what's our definition for that? How do we talk about that?
A great question. I think going back to the state's definition, something to be fraud, it needs to be deliberate and it needs to be meant to deceive someone and to take property or money from them. So it's not an honest mistake where somebody transposed a couple of numbers. But there are, we were at a hearing the other day and a state legislator was talking about an organization that had classified people as independent contractors rather than employees and was referring to that as fraud. That could be a form of fraud. Yeah, if they know what they're doing and they were doing that so that they don't have to provide the same protections as they would need to provide for employees, yeah, that's fraud. But those rules are also pretty complicated. And so if it was just an honest mistake, then it's not fraud. And I think that's a really hard thing to parse out. As we were looking for the report and looked at 3 major cases of fraud, we were looking at things that happened recently. So since Feeding Our Future, that were in the millions of dollars and that were highly publicized in the news. We also looked into quite a few other cases where, it was 1 or 2 individuals who had a for-profit business, all for-profits, and committed fraud that cost the state, $50,000, which is a big deal. And we obviously don't want that happening. But like we said earlier, you got to start somewhere. So let's start with the cases that are costing millions of dollars and fix that, and then move on to some of the smaller things.
Wonderful. And I would also lean into some of the language that Josh also just shared, right, around how do we talk about this? What is actually fraud and what is not fraud? That was really helpful. Thank you. So we have some time, but we're getting to the end of our questions. So I see a couple more popping in. Here's one. We recently had to put easily over 100 staff hours into additional hurdles for state grant work. Wow. How do we tastefully highlight this expenditure that's very kind of you to funders and state leaders?
Great question. I love that you want to do that because some of the additional burden is because of new state statute. So if it's something related to like a pre-award risk assessment, some of that is new. Some of it is state agencies swinging the pendulum too far and being very, very cautious and asking for lots and lots of documentation because they don't want to have fraud happen through one of their programs, which is fair, but they go a bit too far. I think So that first part, some of it is from the legislature, making sure that the lawmakers know it's happening is really helpful. Otherwise, they have no idea. When we do trainings for nonprofits on, how to lobby, how to engage in advocacy, we talk about nonprofit superpowers, and one of them is that nonprofits see how policies are effective in the real world. They see what's happening. And so a legislator can pass a law saying, now, grantees need to do these 8 things. Okay, law passes, done. If nobody goes back and tells them, hey, actually, that 4th thing is a huge pain and it's costing us all this money and it's not worth getting a state grant anymore, and we might not apply next time, which means, hey, state, you have a smaller pool of applicants, which means you're not going to get the best entity to partner with you that you could. I think that's one thing, right? To say you're going to have fewer partners if you make this too difficult. And I think emphasizing, it's not that we're against oversight, it's that we're against oversight that doesn't make any sense, right? Like some oversight is very good, and some is terrible. So because it's duplicative or it's burdensome or what have you.
Oversight has a place, and we actually want to make sure that we're using our state dollars as effectively as possible.
Yeah.
And you got to work with us to make sure that it's actually doing the things that you think that it is, which is
Small tangent.
yeah.
Sorry.
Go for it. You
We
go.
have time.
We got time.
I'm queen of tangents. To become a nonprofit, you have to fill out a IRS form 1023, and it's pretty extensive, and that's good. There's also form 1023 easy, which is obviously the easier version of the 1023. And we hate that form. The 1023 easy is too easy. It's allowing entities to become C3 nonprofits and be tax exempt that should not be. So then the problem is when they do something bad, it reflects on all of us because they have that status. And so that's one instance where it's like, we actually want more oversight. We want to make sure that when nonprofits become nonprofits, they are appropriately vetted so that they can, join our elite association of wonderful organizations.
Love that tangent. Very welcome. Okay, keeping on the compliance train, it seems we have a comment here, a question around compliance requirements. So it seems with new compliance requirements for grants contracts administered by the state that one downstream effect is that it will make it harder for smaller nonprofits to secure a state grant or contract, even outside these particular programs mentioned. And they're talking specifically around food, housing, autism, so all programs, right? What other downstream effects is MCN anticipating may impact the sector besides making it more difficult to secure a grant or contract?
It's a really good question.
Really good question.
I'll mention one that I know of, and then would definitely be curious to hear your thoughts as well, Hala, or others. If other folks have thoughts, throw them in the chat as well, because we would like to hear them. It has to do with fundraising and working with donors, and having to answer that question. How do I know you're not committing fraud? That wasn't a question I think most nonprofits had to answer 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but now it's actually coming up quite a bit. And so, needing these talking points at all is a major downstream effect, I think.
I fully agree. I think beyond the stricter requirements for the state that will make it harder, right, for organizations to gain access to the funding that the state is asking for, the services the state is asking us to provide, which I think is a really important thing to continue to name. Is that
Well, I am remembering that we also had questions for the folks on the call.
we do have questions for folks on the call, and I'm going to get to that right after this one.
Love it.
We're
Same
moving.
page.
But I think the piece, right, is it erodes and it impacts the trust that our communities have in our work. And we know that the superpower of nonprofits is that nonprofits are often led and supported by our neighbors. And so when we see that eroded, when we see trust in our work impact the ability to not just get state funding, but to fund and keep the lights on, it impacts our communities directly. So the most downstream effect for me is the neighbors that aren't getting the services and the needs that should be fulfilled, either by the state or by funders or by the federal government, whatever that may be. Those impacts will end up impacting and hitting all of us. And I did
Absolutely.
just see one, well, there's another question here that I don't think we're going to get to because we're going to pivot into a couple questions that we'd love for folks to chime in the chat on. But really appreciate all of the time that folks spent on some of this. And yes, to being struck by feeding our future. And the question is how nonprofits collectively might set the bar from within of how we as a sector might seek change. And I think that's the question, right? There's also pieces around what are the vulnerabilities that we need to identify for ourselves. And I think we're also grappling with that and trying to think through it. And also, how do we make sure that we're also not policing our own work in a way that makes it impossible to do the work, right? We want oversight that is measured and that makes sense for the systems and the things that we're doing, but we don't want to make it impossible for particularly smaller, rural-based and culturally specific nonprofits to do their really important work. But we're going to pivot a little bit because we have a couple more minutes, and we're going to get into a couple of questions for you all. And you can answer, I think, in the chat. That's probably the best way to do this. One, we'll have some polling right at the end of this for folks to answer, but we want to hear from you. What do you need as nonprofits, as leaders, to be able to speak loudly and confidently about your work? And what are we missing? And so we'll give a couple seconds. There's some good comments happening right now, building off of Brian's comment. Yeah, lots of good conversation. And as you're thinking about that one, also think about this question. Are you getting questions about fraud that you're unable to respond to and that this presentation didn't answer? Because for us, spoiler alert, the next phase is trying to figure out what do we still not know and how do we start to dig into that? Getting some answers coming in. Answer from Maeve on some media highlights and spotlights and nonprofit work in detail in our regular cadence. Yes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We can't transform a narrative if our voices aren't present in it. As a new nonprofit struggling with credibility, no one knows about us yet. Yeah, that's real. I think being able to recognize that new or old, we're all swimming in the same water. I don't know if that makes it feel any better, but just to say that we're all navigating that together. T shared about not receiving questions about anxiety or fraud, but that anxiety is still there. Yeah. Too easy to become a 501c3. Okay. And then Marie, this might be a good one for you to glom onto. I'd love to see more collaboration between nonprofits and the state agencies that administer grants.
Yes, so would I. Thank you. Yes. One of the difficult things about the state and grants and making any inroads is that there are, at last count, I think over 30 state agencies that provide grants. It was 26 a few years ago, but it's grown. And then there's this centralized office of grants management that has policies that we talked about earlier. And we have found it to be difficult to kind of break into some of those spaces. But one great thing, we have contacts in a few state agencies, a few of the bigger ones, who are wonderful and really, really want to work with nonprofits on some of these issues and on bigger things, just kind of understanding. We talked to Kari and I, our colleague, Department of Children, Youth, and Families. It's a fairly new department, and so they're setting up their grant system. And they wanted to hear our thoughts on how to make sure that their grant applications are fair. How are they making sure that they're not overly burdensome so that they're getting applications from small organizations and rural organizations? And that was so fantastic. So, when we get requests like that, we are there. And we were like, tell all your friends at other agencies, we will come talk to them. So I absolutely agree. And I know it's really difficult to, when you are a grantee, to provide feedback to your agency because they are funding you, and you know, some people take those things personally. And so I think that's a big part of why MCN has taken on a lot of this, is that we know that's a great role of an association to be able to say, okay, lots of our members are having issues here, but it's really hard for them individually to talk about it. We can come in and we can tell the state what they're doing wrong, and we can work with different state agencies. I'll note as well, we had our finance conference, MCN's finance conference on Thursday, and there were 3 state employees there from the Department of Human Services. And I was talking to one of them, which happened to run into, and he said something like 90% of their work is working with nonprofits that they provide grants to and partner with. And so they wanted to really understand how nonprofits are thinking about their finances and learning more about nonprofit finances so that they could be the best partners. I was like, what? Like, this is so great. Please tell more people to do this. So we're making some inroads, but it's slow going for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So I think we're winding down a bit. I'm seeing some folks shift off. So I think let's transition into a couple of our closing poll questions. Just want to also flag, it was dropped in the chat, but we will absolutely make sure that resources that were named here, including the slide deck, is shared with participants. We want you to have access to all of it, particularly the surveys. Saw a couple requests for those as well. But first question is really, it's the same as the question you were asked at the beginning, or one of the questions very similar. Actually, no, this one is not. It is, has this town hall given you additional context or facts around fraud narratives? Simple yes or no. And then this one is the same question that we asked at the beginning, which is how comfortable are you responding to narratives around fraud and nonprofits? So 0 ranging from please don't ever ask me about this to 10, I am ready to yell into a bullhorn. I know exactly what I'm saying and I know exactly what happened. We'll give a couple minutes and let folks respond. Wonderful.
And while we're waiting, I'll just add, if there are things that you're thinking, oh, I was really hoping this session was going to cover X, or if I had data on this, or whatever it is, you can email Hala and I, or one or either of us, and let us know, because we think we're covering things that are pretty darn important. But if there are other things that we're missing, we want to help out. So let us know if we are missing big things or small.
Absolutely. And to just name, right, in a space this large, getting in as in the weeds as I think we would love to be able to do is hard to do. So if you're ever looking for just like some additional context or want to chat about this, we spend a lot of time thinking about it, fortunately and unfortunately. Wonderful. Okay. Well, with that, we are so grateful that folks took some time to connect with us today. It's hard to have to be excited about conversations about this that are so hot button and so entrenched in really big feelings. But I think being able to break it down has been really helpful for us, and we hope that it was helpful for you. Again, if you have additional questions, you are looking for additional resources, or if you're just trying to think about how do we talk about this with our neighbors, with our donors, with legislators, we are actively continuing to work on talking points and thinking about all of the different ways that we can make sure that lawmakers are as informed as possible about our work and the work ahead. Thank you so much.